Most people go through life thinking that change happens when the timing is right, when the stars align, or when some mysterious force outside of them finally decides they've suffered enough and it's time to be rewarded. And that belief, that something outside is holding all the power, is the very thing that keeps life feeling out of reach, because no one ever told them the truth. No one ever sat them down and said, "Hey, you're not waiting for the universe. You're ignoring the part of you that actually creates everything." And that truth, it flips everything upside down. Because it means that the waiting, the hoping, the constant checking for signs or results, that's not neutral. That's creation too. But it's creation based on absence, on lack, on the assumption that something is still missing. And that assumption, when it reaches the subconscious, becomes the law that reality must obey. See, there's a part of consciousness that's loud. It talks all day. It thinks, it analyzes, it over-explains. It's what most people think they are. The voice in the head that's always trying to figure it out. That's the conscious mind. But there's another part. And it doesn't talk. It doesn't think in words. It simply accepts. It listens quietly, without judgment. And once it believes something, once it feels it is real, it brings it into form. That's the subconscious. And while the conscious mind might be busy repeating affirmations, visualizing, watching videos, and trying to do it right, the subconscious is sitting there, watching, feeling, absorbing. Not what's being said, but what's being felt. Not the words, but the energy underneath them. That's why someone can say "I am loved" 1,000 times. But if the feeling inside is still "I'm alone," then the subconscious hears that instead. And because the subconscious doesn't argue, it simply accepts that feeling as truth and reflects it back in the outer world. Not out of cruelty, not out of judgment, but because that's its job. That's how it works. This is the dual nature of consciousness that Neville Goddard talked about. Not as a metaphor, not as poetry, but as a literal map of how imagination becomes reality. The conscious mind is the one that chooses. It's the director, the seed planter. The subconscious is the soil. It receives the seed, it nurtures it, and it produces the fruit, good or bad, depending on what was planted. So when nothing is changing, it's not because the universe is testing or punishing or waiting for some divine timing. It's because the conscious mind hasn't learned how to speak the language of the subconscious. It hasn't learned to go beyond words and into feeling. And until that happens, manifestation stays in the realm of theory. But once that inner communication is clear, once the conscious lovingly impresses a new assumption and the subconscious accepts it, the whole world begins to move, quietly, naturally, and without struggle. It's wild to think about how much pressure people put on themselves to change their lives while unknowingly ignoring the part of themselves that actually holds the power to do it. The conscious mind is the one that gets all the credit. It's the one that reads the books, watches the videos, sets goals, makes vision boards, and tries to stay high vibe. It works hard, plans everything, and never stops trying to fix, heal, improve, or understand. But no one tells you that this part of the mind isn't the one that creates reality. It can choose, it can direct, but it cannot produce. The part of consciousness that produces is the subconscious, and most people don't even realize they're communicating with it all the time, just not intentionally. That's the reason manifestation feels like a mystery to so many. They think they're doing everything right, repeating affirmations, staying positive, visualizing what they want. But what they don't realize is that the subconscious doesn't respond to those actions directly. It responds to what feels natural. It responds to what has been accepted as true without force. If the words being spoken feel fake, if the affirmations feel like a stretch, if the images being visualized still carry the taste of longing or not having, then the subconscious mind hears the absence, not the desire. And that's exactly what it reflects. This is why people often get confused or frustrated when they see no results. They're working with the conscious mind only, trying to think their way into a new reality. But the subconscious doesn't speak in thoughts. It speaks in emotion, in repetition, in states of being. And if that state still feels like lack, loneliness, fear, or resistance, then that's the seed that gets planted, even if the words say otherwise. It's like saying "I'm abundant" with your mouth while your body still flinches when you check your bank account. Or saying "I'm loved" while still checking your phone every 5 minutes hoping for a message. The subconscious picks up on that contradiction. And since it doesn't argue, it just accepts whatever is felt the strongest. The secret is that there's already a communication happening between conscious and subconscious, all day, every day. But most people aren't directing it. They're letting old beliefs, old assumptions, old identities keep impressing themselves over and over again. And they don't even realize it. Because the conscious mind is too busy trying to fix what only the subconscious can transform. That's where real power lies, not in thinking harder or doing more, but in learning how to shift what's being accepted below the surface. When that shift happens, the outer world doesn't need to be forced. It starts bending to the new inner reality. Not because someone tried to make it happen, but because they finally stopped sending mixed signals and started speaking the one language creation actually understands: feeling, belief, and acceptance. There's something profound that gets missed in almost every conversation about manifestation, and that's the relationship between the conscious and subconscious, not as two separate minds fighting each other, but as a relationship between two parts of oneself, a dynamic that works together either in harmony or in contradiction. Neville Goddard often described this as the masculine and feminine aspects of consciousness, not in terms of gender or roles, but in terms of function. The conscious is the part that chooses, decides, directs, it initiates the thought, sets the intention, and impresses an idea. The subconscious is the part that receives that idea, holds it close, nurtures it, and eventually brings it into being. One plants the seed, the other gives it life. When this relationship is healthy, when there's trust between the two, things move. Manifestation becomes natural. Life begins to reflect what's been impressed internally. But when there's doubt, fear, mixed signals, or constant interference from the conscious mind trying to check or force outcomes, that inner relationship starts to fall apart. It becomes chaotic. It becomes noisy. It starts to reflect that same confusion back into life, where the things desired feel just out of reach, where progress feels like it's always slipping through the cracks, where the harder someone tries, the more resistance they seem to meet. The truth is, the subconscious doesn't resist. It doesn't argue. It doesn't debate. It accepts whatever is consistently and emotionally felt as real. It receives every thought that's repeated with conviction, every story that's told with emotion, every reaction that gets replayed again and again. And if those stories are rooted in fear, rejection, not enoughness, or anxiety, then that becomes the blueprint that gets used to shape the world outside. Not because the subconscious wants to hurt or punish, but because it doesn't filter. It simply says, okay, this must be who we are. This must be what's real. Let me bring this into form. So when someone changes their outer behavior but still holds the same assumptions, the results don't change. When they speak words of confidence but still carry feelings of doubt, nothing shifts. Because it's not the conscious performance that creates, it's the subconscious acceptance. And that acceptance only happens when something feels natural. When it stops feeling like a dream in the distance and starts feeling like home. That's the point where creation begins. That's when the seed takes root. What this really means is that manifestation is not about control. It's about surrender, not surrender to fate or chance, but to the inner relationship between the parts of consciousness. The conscious must lovingly and confidently impress the idea, and then let it go, trusting that the subconscious will do its job. When that trust is there, there's no need to check, no need to force, no need to doubt, because just like in nature, once a seed is planted in fertile soil, growth is inevitable, not through struggle, but through quiet, unseen, faithful unfolding. One of the most powerful things Neville Goddard ever said was that feeling is the secret. But so many people misunderstood what that really means. They heard it and thought it was about forcing themselves to feel excited or happy or blissful all the time. They thought manifestation required staying in some kind of perfect emotional state, as if one dip into sadness or doubt would ruin everything. But that's not what he meant. Feeling, in this context, doesn't mean chasing positive emotions or pretending to be okay. It means sinking into the natural feeling of the wish fulfilled. It means entering the state of already having. Not by thinking about it or repeating it, but by letting the body, the breath, the inner world start to believe it's already true. The truth is, the subconscious doesn't understand future tense. It doesn't know someday or maybe or soon. It only knows now. It only accepts what feels real in the present moment. So when someone says they're manifesting love or abundance or confidence, but everything inside still feels like lack and waiting, the subconscious doesn't hear the desire, it hears the absence. And that becomes the state it reproduces. But the moment that state changes, not the words, not the surface level thoughts, but the actual felt identity, everything starts to shift. Not through effort, not through action, but through the law of assumption, which says that what is assumed to be true, if persisted in, will harden into fact. That's why thinking alone can't create. That's why effort and trying harder just lead to burnout. Because the subconscious isn't looking for a checklist. It's looking for congruence. It wants the inner atmosphere to match the outer claim. It wants to feel that the thing being asked for is already known, already accepted, already lived, even if only in imagination. And once that inner shift happens, once it starts to feel natural to be in that new state, reality begins to move in quiet, subtle, powerful ways. People show up differently. Opportunities unfold. Old patterns break apart, and what once felt like struggle starts to feel like flow. This is where most give up, because they keep checking the outer world for proof instead of staying loyal to the feeling within. They leave the state too soon. They assume it's not working, so they go back to searching, overthinking, chasing. But all of that is just the old self trying to stay alive. The work is to return to the feeling, again and again, until it becomes who you are, until it no longer feels like pretending, but remembering. That's the secret Neville pointed to. That's what he meant when he said creation is finished. not because everything is fixed, but because all possibilities already exist. The only thing left to do is to occupy the one you want, emotionally, faithfully, until it becomes your new home. And once that happens, the world has no choice but to catch up. There's something deeply humbling about realizing that the life being lived right now is not happening to punish or reward, but simply to reflect. Everything showing up in the outer world is a mirror of what has already been accepted within, not always consciously, but deeply, emotionally, silently. That's why trying to control circumstances doesn't work. That's why pushing harder, doing more, or chasing results only creates more delay. Because those actions are still rooted in the belief that something is missing, that it's not already done, that something outside still needs to change before peace, love, or worthiness can be felt. But what if nothing outside ever had to change first? What if reality didn't shift when it was forced, but only when it was allowed? What if the whole point wasn't to make it happen, but to let it be done, to live as if it already is, even when the senses scream the opposite? That's the real turning point. That's where the old self starts to crumble, not because it's wrong or broken, but because it can't come with you into the new state. It was built on waiting, doubting, earning, needing. But the new self, the one who already is, already has, already knows, doesn't fight for proof. It doesn't beg, chase, or hustle. It assumes, it accepts, and it moves differently because of it. Manifestation, at its core, isn't about creating something from thin air. It's about selecting a new version of reality and embodying it so fully that everything not in alignment with it has no choice but to fall away. And this happens in stillness, not in striving. It happens when someone finally gets tired of the noise, the obsession, the endless seeking, and instead decides to trust the process, to sit in the feeling of already being the version of themselves that has the thing they used to chase, to feel it in their breath, their posture, their thoughts, their reactions, not perfectly, not constantly, but consistently enough that it begins to feel normal. Because once something feels normal, once it stops feeling like a fantasy and starts feeling like fact, the subconscious goes to work, not just in mystical, invisible ways, but in practical ones too. Ideas come that weren't there before. People respond differently. Desires change. The world reshapes, not because of force, but because of resonance. The outer life begins to match the inner state, like a melody echoing the key it was sung in. And the best part, it all feels so natural that it doesn't even feel like a miracle. It feels obvious, like, of course it happened. Of course this is real. Because that's how creation actually works, not in flashes of magic, but in the quiet confidence of someone who finally stopped trying to get and simply allowed themselves to be. Everything starts to change the moment it's realized that the power to create, the power to choose, and the power to transform was never outside, never in the hands of circumstances or other people or luck. It was always inside, quietly waiting to be claimed. This is the moment the old story starts to lose its grip. Not because anything is being forced or resisted, but because it's no longer needed. The identity that was built on fear, on proving, on waiting for permission begins to fall away. And what's left isn't someone who's finally worthy, it's someone who realizes they always were. That's what Neville was really pointing to all along. That creation isn't something that happens one day out in the future. It's happening now. It's always been happening. Every assumption, every reaction, every quiet belief has been shaping the story all along. And once that's seen clearly, once that's accepted, the question is no longer, how do I make this happen? It becomes, who am I being now? Because who you are being, not what you are doing or saying or hoping, is what's writing the next chapter. And this isn't about perfection. It's not about never having a bad thought or a moment of fear. It's about returning to the truth again and again until it becomes home. The truth that the conscious and subconscious are always in relationship, always in communication. The truth that the subconscious doesn't judge, it simply accepts what's given to it with feeling. The truth that manifestation isn't about deserving, but about accepting. And the truth that life is not happening randomly. It's responding to the dominant feeling state being lived in. This is where the game completely shifts, because now, instead of reacting to the world, there's space to respond from a deeper place. Instead of waiting for something to prove it's working, there's peace in knowing it's already done. Instead of needing the world to change first, there's a quiet confidence that the world will catch up to who you've become. And this doesn't mean sitting around doing nothing. It means moving from alignment, from intuition, from a felt sense of certainty, not as a strategy to make something happen, but because you've already accepted that it's yours. The irony is, what once felt like struggle now feels like simplicity. What once felt like effort now feels like flow. And what once felt like a goal far away now feels like a memory, something already claimed in the unseen, just waiting to unfold in the scene. That's what makes this work so powerful. That's what makes it sacred. Not that it changes the world outside first, but that it changes the self within. And once that shift happens, the outer world has no choice but to reflect it, not because it was forced, but because it was finally allowed. So if the question is, when will it happen? Maybe the answer is, the moment you decide that it already has. If this hit something deep inside you, if something finally clicked, drop a comment and just write, "I let it be done." Because sometimes the most powerful shift begins when you stop trying to fix everything and finally accept that it's already yours. I will meet you with another golden nugget. Happy manifesting.